Welcome to the Sporting Chance Forum 2021, brought to you by the Center for Sport and Human Rights. Please follow the Center online at sporthumanrights.org, on LinkedIn and Twitter at sportandrights. Don't forget to use the conference hashtag SCF21. My name is Vincent Gaillard. I'm a board director at the Center for Sport and Human Rights. Delighted to moderate this session today and to be welcoming some very distinguished guests whom I will introduce shortly. Mary Robinson, as the Center's chair and president of the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice, readily reminds us of the interconnectivity between climate change and human rights. Today, we're looking at this intersection in the context of sport. At your convenience, check out a podcast which Mary Robinson did with Mary Harvey on the Center's channel, Sport and Rights podcast, on this topic earlier this year. You'll find that on the Sport and Human Rights platform. As we start to come out of COVID, we recognize that human rights and climate change will be of crucial importance for the sport ecosystem. Sport has a duty of care to people and the environment in around sport and major events. And this panel will look at how we can work together for better on both fronts. Our starting point for today's conversation, the Center's Sporting Chance principles, which are underpinned by the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights Framework. Let us recall that the Sporting Chance principle number 4 calls on all actors involved in sport to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how they address their impacts on human rights through a robust and ongoing human rights due diligence. And also Sporting Chance principle number 9, which encourages all actors involved in sport to be a source of inspiration and to forge collective solutions to address human rights challenges that are beyond the capacity of any single stakeholder to resolve. So this session is particularly about prevention and harnessing opportunities. I am delighted to welcome this panel to explore answers to some of these questions, and our 3 guests, Seán McCabe, Elena Arengo, and Jason Twill. Seán McCabe, in January 2021, Seán became world football's first climate justice officer with the Bohemian Football Club in Ireland, and he's working with the Bohemian FC, the League of Ireland, and partners in Europe to advance climate action in football that is good for the clubs, fans, and the planet. Seán is executive manager of the TASC Climate Justice Center and focuses on developing evidence-based, people-centered, and community-led climate action strategies. Prior to joining TASC, Seán worked with former Irish President Mary Robinson in the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice, where he engaged in negotiation on the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Elena Arengo is co-executive director of PODER, Project on Organization, Development, Education, and Research, a Mexico-based civil society organization that advocates for corporate transparency and accountability in Latin America, particularly for the rights of communities impacted by extractive industries and large infrastructure projects. She has over 15 years of experience in corporate accountability and human rights and worked extensively on workers' rights in global supply chain industries in Nicaragua, Bangladesh, and Thailand. Jason Twill is a director, World Cup programs at the Qatar Foundation. He has a career spanning over 22 years in climate change, education, sustainability, urban regeneration, and social justice. Based in Doha, Jason is leading the Qatar Foundation's work in shaping the legacy of Qatar's hosting of the 2022 FIFA World Cup. Jason is a co-founder of both the International Living Future Institute and the Green Sports Alliance, and was named a 2015 and 2017 Next City Global Urban Vanguard. So let's get started with a first round of questions. Seán, would you help us set the scene, if you will, by putting yourself in the shoes of a sports body or a club doing its due diligence on human rights and climate change? So tell us 2 things, if you don't mind. What you see as some of the potential risks to sport and sports participation that may arise as we confront more extreme weather events and incremental climate change, but also which impact from sport and sport events are likely to have the biggest impact on the climate, workers, and people living in nearby communities. Seán, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vincent, and that's quite an easy question to kick things off. It's a great pleasure, first of all, to be here and be speaking with you. I think the fundamental point here is that the sporting community is wholly dependent on a healthy environment and a stable climate to survive. So I want to touch on 3 points very quickly. The first is the impact of climate change on sport. All of our colleagues on the panel here today will speak to this, but we've already seen how extreme heat is interfering with grassroots and professional athletes, how storms are interfering with the running of sports events, and we will only see more of this as we continue into this crisis. Athletes playing in increasingly severe temperatures are at severe health risks, and so it is inevitable that we will see more and more interruption to sporting calendars. Severe storms will cause flooding risk to sports infrastructure, both grassroots and professional, and we'll see that interrupting sporting calendars as well. And then also there's the issue of smoke and air pollution caused by forest fires, for example, or simply the burning of fossil fuels, which have severe impact on respiratory systems, on the right to health, particularly for children and young athletes who are still forming and at acute risk. I think maybe something we don't think about as much, however, is the justice dimension of all of this. We know that the impacts of climate change hit the poorest first and hardest. So in terms of participation, it will be the lower income households and minority communities who see their ability to participate in sport most severely curtailed by the climate crisis. This is inevitable. The disfiguration is hard to fully comprehend, and we don't have the data to grasp the extent of it yet. There's some interesting studies that could be done in this regard. We could use Hurricane Katrina as an example, which devastated New Orleans in late August 2005. At the time, New Orleans was one of the poorest cities in the US, and the storm displaced huge numbers of people, many of whom never returned. We know that it was the poorest in the city who were most severely impacted. And we can only assume that it devastated the grassroots sports infrastructure in the city. We don't know the extent to which it did. It certainly caused enormous damage to the professional sporting infrastructure. In the wake of the storm, the city spent nearly 500 million restoring the sports facilities. And subsequently, New Orleans hosted a couple of mega sporting events, including the Super Bowl and the NCAA's men's basketball Final Four. So the large institutions were resilient, and there's legitimate questions about the use of public funding for events, who benefits in the city. But what we don't know is the toll that it took on the grassroots sporting communities. We could use the economy of the city perhaps as a proxy. We know that a year after Katrina, only 44% of food establishments were up and running as compared to prior to the storm. And we know now, 10, 15 years later, that the economy still hasn't fully recovered. I would say the same is true about grassroots sport, but we don't have the data. The final point I'd just like to touch on before moving on, and I think this speaks to your second question, Vincent, is, the climate crisis is fundamentally a human rights crisis, as you mentioned to begin with. And the further we go into this crisis, the more apparent it will be that it's not simply sports we need to worry about, it's our societies, it's the survival of our democracies, and it's our own lives. We know that the fallout from climate breakdown impacts on a wide range of human rights, the right to health, to water, cultures, work, self-determination, even the right to life. What we need to consider, though, and we need to, sport in particular has to reckon with this, is how climate action itself can harm human rights. And we must ensure that the action we take in response to the climate crisis doesn't result in us doing more harm. The Business and Human Rights Resource Centre produced a report shortly before the Paris negotiations for the Paris Agreement, which highlighted that renewable energy was seeing a spike in human rights allegations against it. So we need to understand, as we transition rapidly, how do we procure goods and services in such a way that these do not undermine human rights or trample on the rights and dignity of people around the world? How do we take part in ensuring that our action on climate also uplifts people? It ensures that they can realize their rights and have their well-being boosted or improved, enhanced through the transition. I'll leave it there, and I think we'll touch on this more as we go on.
Many thanks, Seán. That certainly was a great way to set the scene, so thank you for that. We're in the heart of the subject now. So I'm turning to you, Elena. I understand that Poder works on corporate transparency and accountability in Central and Latin America. But as an organization based in Mexico City, you are monitoring the stakeholder consultation process being developed in Mexico for the United 2026 FIFA World Cup. So what do you anticipate as being some of the major areas of concern for local communities on human rights and environmental justice, as this or indeed other sports events are planned?
Yes, thank you for that introduction, Vincent, and thank you to the organizers for inviting us to be part of this panel. Poder is part of a group of human rights and environmental civil society organizations in Mexico that have very recently started to look at the terrain in terms of actors, key industries, and areas of concern associated with the 2026 FIFA World Cup. Which is, as you know, scheduled to take place in cities in Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And this work of the civil society organizations is very much in the early stages. And currently the 3 cities being considered as hosts in Mexico are Mexico City, Guadalajara, and Monterrey. It's also important to note that several of the processes are being delayed. For example, the human rights reports that candidate host cities need to be submitting. So what are the main areas of concern from the perspective of the civil society organizations? And to identify the risks, we have to look at the main sectors that are going to be involved in the 2026 FIFA World Cup. And one important one is construction. Even though the 2026 event will use pre-existing stadiums, there will be need for some updating, and as well as other surrounding infrastructure updates, for example, public transportation systems and accommodations. Some of the human rights issues that have been identified with large infrastructure projects in Mexico, and which Poder has documented, include weak processes of prior and informed consultation, and a lack of meaningful participation of local communities that will be impacted. And as an example, specifically around the Estadio Azteca in Mexico City, there's a fairly recent history of local opposition to urban development programs in neighborhoods surrounding the stadium, as well as opposition to housing development projects due to water shortages, and local communities are arguing that projects were putting private interests instead of the well-being of communities and the environment. Another area of risk in this sector has been around labor rights, abusive hiring practices, and what are known as protection contracts, which inhibit the right to form independent unions and hiring of vulnerable populations such as migrants. Specifically on factors contributing to climate change, according to environmental organizations, 15% of the national territory is vulnerable to climate change and its effects, and 68% of the population is highly exposed to associated risk. The main source of the greenhouse, just to mention, Mexico is currently among the top 13 countries in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and the main sources being the energy sector, followed by public transportation and waste management. All 3 of these being key sectors that will engage in be engaged in host cities. Another cause for concern is lack of transparency in contracts, which Poder also works on, which can hide and breed cases of corruption. And finally, in terms of risk factors, it's important to mention the economic recession brought on by COVID. That will likely exacerbate pre-existing inequalities in Mexico and in potential host cities, create public grievances, and possibly even decrease public support for the World Cup. Cities will have to take on commitments for infrastructure, public transportation, security, which could be viewed as not the most optimal use of public funds. Also, the COVID-19 pandemic has created some backsliding in human rights in Mexico, issues with difficulties in exercising the mechanisms for transparency, public problems with public consultation and participation, and heightened risks for workers, women, and other vulnerable communities. And so these are just some of the concerns around the 2026 World Cup that the human rights and environmental groups have been identifying, and around which collective action and advocacy can be built around this moment to pressure for change.
Very, very clear. Thank you, Elena. Thank you. Jason, over to you. For you to tell us about really what you see as the starting point for mega sport event organizers, as we call them, when it comes to mapping the potential impacts on climate, particularly where those impacts intersect with people's human rights. What's the baseline in your view today? And really, how can sport, and in particular, big sport events, contribute a positive legacy in terms of climate resilience?
Thank you, and a big prop to the center for actually having a panel focus on this really important topic and shining a bright light on it. And thank you for having the Qatar Foundation involved in this dialogue. I believe any of these major sporting institutions like FIFA, International Olympic Committee, World Tennis Association, if it's PGA, understanding the diplomacy and the influence they have on host countries for major events is crucial. Having their own climate action strategy and plan culturally within those institutions, and how that portrays itself in a tender when there's a bid for these mega events is crucial. And articulating in those tender documents and bids the elements that Elena and Seán so articulated in their discussions just now. And recognizing that climate change is a human issue. It's not a geopolitical issue. It's not a industry issue. It's a fundamentally human issue. And sport has a role to play in galvanizing humanity's response to this. We know full well some of the major statements that have been made about the role of sport in addressing environmental issues and climate change. It has a way to reach people that no other industry really has. So helping shift the narrative around this, I think, is crucial. And I think a lot of these institutions have already been doing that. And you've seen every major event like the Olympics or World Cup every few years get more and more aggressive in their intentions of how a host country addresses this issue from a human rights perspective, from an ecological and social perspective, and the legacy it can lead. When you have, I think there's also the understanding of the equitable distribution of these events, particularly in the global south and hosting these, and how an event like a World Cup or an Olympics or another major world sporting event structurally changes a country. It commits them to action on these issues. And I think that's the diplomacy part. I think that's crucial, and they understand the influence they have. So I think more and more you'll see this becoming like a net zero game. I think, Qatar's hosting the 2022 World Cup has had a miraculous transformation in this country from a human rights perspective, worker welfare, labor progressive rights that are happening, but also the infrastructure that's been evolved here over the last 11 years. And planning for this event and what legacy it leaves for the local population is critical. So there's a 10-year horizon after this, that really looks at the visionary transformation of a country and the role that this, event like a World Cup can have. So it's just continuing on that legacy and how that can be shared to other countries that are emerging economies around the world to be able to host an event like this and what it can do to progress an agenda around climate and climate justice.
Great, thank you, Jason. All right, so before we go on to the next round of questions, we would like to conduct a quick poll with 2 questions for all participants, but certainly for all of those of you coming from institutions operating in and around sport. So the questions will pop in on your screen in just a few seconds. There are 2 questions. I will read over them, and then you will see the results as they come in. So the first question that we would like to ask you today is the following. Has your organization carried out due diligence risk assessments on the impacts of climate change on your operations? Yes, no, or not sure. I repeat, has your organization carried out due diligence risk assessments on the impact of climate change on your operations? Yes, no, or not sure. And I can see that we now have, yeah. Interesting. Okay, so we have about half now on yes and no's. And we're done. Okay. Okay, so roughly 50-50 on yes and no's as it stands. And about a third of the answers uncertain about whether or not a due diligence risk assessment has been conducted. As we wait for the final results, I will read through the second and last question. As part of these climate risks assessments, have you also considered the impact on people's rights? Example, athletes, fans, workers, communities, and others. Yes, no, or not sure. I'll repeat the second question so you can prepare for your votes. As part of these climate risk assessment, have you also considered the impacts on people's rights? Example, athletes, fans, workers, communities, and others. Yes, no, not sure. We're probably about done for the first question, with now a majority of people that have answered that they are not sure about whether or not a due diligence risk assessment has been conducted, followed by 32% of yeses and 30% of no's. Okay, so that's about 40% that we'll have to investigate a bit further in the next few days and weeks to understand exactly what's the status in their organization. We're probably about over now. We'll show the second question now on the screen. Yeah, here you go. Okay, so we have, as it stands on the second question, 38% of people uncertain about about whether or not these impacts have been considered on the relevant individuals and people rights, followed by 35% of yes and 27% of no's. And that looks like it's about completed. Okay. So we will move on to the next series of questions. Starting with Seán again. Seán, to be successful in creating benefits for climate and people, particularly as the situation becomes more urgent, how, in your view, do we enlist sports bodies, event organizers, and clubs, and bring them with us on this journey? What's the role for community-led initiatives in this particular space, in your view?
Thank you very much, Vincent. I think it's important to begin by articulating the risk, and Elena mentioned this very clearly. As we become more aware of the emergency and we rush to act, there is a very real risk that we forget about human rights and we forget about what we need to do to protect people. And what that will lead to, as Elena has mentioned, is resistance, public resistance to the measures that need to be taken. And we don't have time, given the nature of the crisis, we don't have time for this resistance. Now, if we bring that kind of universal reality of the climate crisis into the sporting world and consider what the role of sport is in this, well, you have World Cups, you have Olympics, you have these massive moments of global focus, which can be a lever not just for advocacy for strong and just climate action or environmental action more broadly, but they're also levers of development. And that's the third key pillar of climate justice. It's linking human rights and climate change, but also it's realizing that people need to be enabled to develop and have their options and their potentials expanded, not shrunk by the response to the climate crisis. And so if you imagine, say, for example, a World Cup where you have stadiums in communities where energy poverty exists, where people are not able to necessarily heat their homes, or maybe they're not able, they have to make some god-awful decisions between heating their home and sending their children to school or something like that. In those situations, you could see stadiums act as batteries, solar-powered batteries, that could channel power to the local community and help alleviate energy poverty. That would be massive. That would be an incredible act of solidarity from the organizing body with the communities most at risk from the climate crisis. That would be climate justice. Another example might be if we consider that the World Cup in Russia had a bigger carbon footprint than the entire country of Malawi that same year, which is a very startling reality. We have to think about how these bodies are looking at offsetting emissions. If it is the planting of trees, if it's the creating of green space, let's look at the current availability of green space within our cities and recognize that it overlaps almost globally. It overlaps very strongly with low-income communities. Those people who have the most access to green space, to recreational space, are generally the most affluent communities. So why not use the opportunity created by the need to offset to address the inequality in access to green space in the host cities? And then you start to get into really positive conversations about enabling people to realize their rights, whilst also addressing climate change. And to Elena's point, building social approval, not just for the events you're trying to run, but also for climate action more generally. So you've got a triple win there. And to me, it's really a no-brainer.
Thank you, Seán. Elena, taking into account Sporting Change Principle number 5, which says principled and practical ways should be found to strengthen the voice of all those affected by sport. What, in your view, does more effective stakeholder engagement with local communities in this process looks like? How do we feed the perspectives of those most directly impacted by climate injustice into discussion on reaching equitable climate solutions?
Yes, thanks very much for that question. From a civil society point of view, civil society and NGOs see the World Cup as a moment to draw attention to some of the structural issues in human rights and the root causes of the climate crisis, as well as an opportunity for civil society organizations to organize collectively, broadly, and visibly to advocate to the duty bearers for a lasting change. And what is needed for civil society and communities most affected by the projects around the World Cup is to be enabled and empowered to engage and participate in the processes and projects that are going to impact their human rights, their livelihoods, and their environments. One is a commitment by the duty bearers that these groups will be protected. Human rights and environmental defenders in Mexico and throughout Latin America, in fact, have been targeted with intimidation, threats, violence, and even death, almost always with impunity. The mechanisms for protection and access to justice have to be guaranteed. Another important factor is access to information. Transparent reporting on human rights and impact assessment needs, for example, have to be available to the public and specifically to affected communities so that they can monitor and be informed about the construction, transportation, waste management, et cetera, all the projects that will be that will supply host cities and stadiums. Mechanisms for redress in case of violations and transparent information on how to use these mechanisms are also very important. Mexico is a recent signatory to the Escazú Agreement, which is a binding treaty that guarantees the right to access to environmental information and to participation in environmental decision-making, thereby promoting access to information and access to justice related to environmental matters. And it requires the state to prevent and investigate attacks against those who protect and defend environmental rights. So really, I want to echo some of the things that Jason was saying in terms of the moment for diplomacy and for bringing together powerful stakeholders to bring their weight, the weight of their influence and their resources to be able to advocate for these kinds of factors that enable civil society to participate fully.
Thank you, Elena. Jason, what constitutes emerging good practice on climate resilience sport event legacies that go the extra mile and also take into account human rights impacts?
Well, good practice is, first of all, focusing on areas of the world where you have an ambient climate where it's comfortable for an athlete to perform to their fullest potential. That's a really crucial one. Mm-hmm. And where it's more challenging, that they have from a technical perspective, you're putting in the right infrastructure to make that climate and that local weather pattern work for the performance of the game, match, or event that you're having. I think more and more, though, the dialogue around it not being just a technical issue to solve, it's a cultural and behavioral issue to solve. So looking at how you use an event like this, like a World Cup or an Olympics or another major sporting event, to really shift people's consciousness on this issue, knowing that it's everyone's individual role and responsibility to change their own behaviors and decisions every day in and around how they get to and from a venue. Is it by electric bus, or is it by SUV, or is it by Uber? Helping people, using the sports event as a way to support people and making it easier to make a more sustainable, climate-friendly choice. And I think the trend also is that these are going to be carbon neutral. It's almost like a responsibility. It has to be a carbon neutral event. 2022 is going to be a carbon neutral World Cup, the first one ever. Some of that will be from buying offsets, but a lot of it is on the technical investment of this country, not only in the infrastructure, but also on the behavioral side of things, and really thinking about the fan experience and how the fans can engage an event like that in a climate-friendly way.
Thank you, Jason. There are a couple of questions that I will like to ask to our panel. But just to remind everyone that after that, we'll go into questions from the audience. So if you have any question you would like to ask to our guests, you can put them through the chat box and we will select through them after I'm done with this next round of questions. Seán, back to you. How do we encourage all of us in the sports ecosystem, but in particular sports bodies and clubs, to do this well? So we have ultimately a win for climate and human rights. How can sport become a champion of rights, respecting climate resilience for other sectors of society, in your view?
Thank you, Vincent. I think we have a long way to go. First of all, we have to acknowledge that, and we don't have very much time in which to do all of this, given the nature of the climate crisis. I think we need clubs to be very courageous. We need organizations to be very courageous. This is a very, very serious issue. As late Bill Shankly would have said, it's not a matter of life and death. It's much more important than that. And it genuinely is. I think there are a number of ways in which sports have to become platforms for championing real transformative change, and it has to be rights-based and rights-informed. So as Elena and Jason have said, there are really powerful diplomacy measures that individual events can do in going into countries and encouraging better practice and encouraging abiding by the ESCASU agreement or the Aarhus agreement or any other of our mechanisms that are there, like to the Ruggie principles exist. We need a sports equivalent. We're moving in those directions with the Centre for Sports and Human Rights. Where we can really see the profound impact of sport, though, and I think this was when I joined Bohemian Football Club as their climate justice officer, the response globally was phenomenal, because sport reaches the lives of people all over the world in a much more profound way than anything else that we could speak about in these spheres. And so, for example, this week, the Human Rights Council in Geneva will decide whether to recognize the right to a healthy environment. If sporting organizations around the world were informing their communities of this moment, it would mean a great deal to the negotiators and the diplomats trying to get that recognition over the line. And it in turn would have a fundamental impact on how the rule of law could be used in addressing environmental issues. Similarly, at COP, there are some very significant decisions to be taken at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's Conference of the Parties taking place in Glasgow this year. If we were mobilizing clubs, it's probably too late for this year, but for COP27, it certainly isn't. If we were mobilizing clubs and organizations around messaging, key messaging on the details of those negotiations, informing their followers of how these negotiations matter in their own lives, I think we would see a much quicker, more effective COP process because of the pressures that would bring on them. So a little bit similar to what Jason and Elena have been saying about influence on diplomacy. Sport could have a fundamental impact on the enabling environment for fair and effective climate action if it had a unified approach and a guided approach. I think it could be phenomenal, and it is the game changer the world has been waiting for.
Elena, I have the exact same question for you. How do we encourage everyone in the sports ecosystem to do this well? So we end up with what we want ultimately, and that's a win for climate and human rights.
Thank you. So with the 2020 World Cup, we think there's an opportunity for sports bodies to use their influence in several ways to advance and respect human rights and environmental sustainability in proactive ways, and not just through a do no harm approach. One is for local sports bodies to make public commitments to adopt and implement, for example, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and to make public commitments to transparency. And another area is to work together with business partners to strengthen commitments to human rights and environmental justice, specifically businesses and brands in sectors that will be most engaged in the event: hospitality, brands making licensed apparel and sporting goods, and the food and beverage industry. There's an opportunity there to work together on commitments for human rights, labor rights, environmental sustainability, due diligence, and transparency.
Jason, your own answer to that same question?
Yeah, I mean, it's both, I think, top down and bottom up. And I feel like the top down is really working. I think these major entities and institutions really do have a commitment, and they're authentically delivering on that. Or I see even greater powerful and chance for scale change at grassroots level. And recognizing that this issue of climate change disproportionately affects low-income economies, either locally within inner city areas, but also globally, recognizing that 72% of the world's population are dealing with what we call a double deficit disorder, meaning they have low capacity for ecological productive land, for food, fresh water, but also have a low income, economy, so they can't invest in that transformation. So it's using sports as a means to kind of really look at how we respond to this at a planetary level and the grassroots level. Because I think the real meaningful change happens at the grassroots, and ensuring that every child and young kid out there has a right to play, has a right to fresh air, fresh water, and food, not being in a food desert. And I think athletes play a profound role in influencing that change, as do these leagues and major institutions. So I think, we've been working on this for a long time at the Green Sports Alliance. I think we introduced climate justice, environmental justice more broadly about 4 or 5 years ago at one of our summits, and it was the most attended. It was packed. You could standing room only. So we know it's a hot topic. I think sports entities understand their responsibility in addressing this squarely. And it's partnering institutions like Elena and Seán's and the center to really, make real change happen.
Fair enough. Well, I'll now take a few questions we've received from the participants. Staying with you, Jason, for this first one. From your experience, with GSA for certain, but now with a global event, Are there tools and monitoring mechanisms that can support compliance from host countries?
Yes, I think, well, one is that you're monitoring carbon emissions. That's a science-based methodology. That's really, looking at the Carbon Disclosure Project, so that you are looking at the governance of the event using the IPCC scientists, methodologies for tracking, monitoring, and offsetting or addressing carbon emissions that are directly from scope 1, 2, and 3 from an event, right? And then how do you put the architecture around hosting that event to address that, right? So I think that's a question here, whether it's justifiable or acceptable for these events to even happen right now, knowing that we have this crisis fully underway, not an emerging climate crisis, it's fully underway. But I think there's real change can happen from these events. So it's not avoiding them, but addressing them in a responsible manner. And I think the other tools are working with the UN, Human Rights Convention, and again, partnering with local NGOs and civil society institutions to work hand in hand with the host country government. If it's a single country or if it's multiple countries hosting an event, that they collaborate beyond geopolitical boundaries and look at this from a regional perspective. I think there's lots of tools around that to support hosting events like this.
Elena, also same question for you in terms of your awareness of those tools and mechanisms that can support the organizers in the case of United 26 bid.
Yes, again, I'll emphasize the UN guiding principles on business and human rights for business partners around these events, and the private sector, due diligence processes, and also instruments the international instruments that protect the right to information and human rights and environmental defenders. Again, I think it's a moment these are moments to highlight the importance of these instruments and the commitments of governments, not only just of the municipal governments and of the host cities to produce these assessments and to be transparent about them, but also the state and the national governments as well.
Yeah. We have another question which I will ask to you, Seán. In less than 1 month, the COP26 will meet in Glasgow. Will the conference have a focus on the rights of people? Is the sport dimension somehow going to be covered?
In terms of a focus on the rights of people, I would say, unfortunately, not a sufficient focus. But that has always been the case with the climate negotiations. As Jason has said many times, it's often viewed exclusively as a technical issue to be solved rather than a social and cultural issue, and one which intersects immediately with people's rights. That said, there has been significant progress in the run-up to Paris, and subsequently. The first time human rights appeared in a COP decision was way back in Cancun in 2010. And, Paris did have language around human rights in the agreement, and there is now a Paris Committee on Capacity Building, which focuses on how human rights is being integrated across climate action. There's a gender action plan under the COP. I currently work with an organization or an initiative called the Children's Environmental Rights Initiative, and we're looking to embed children's rights more immediately within the climate negotiation. I think we have a long way to go as well, and a short time to do it, in terms of making climate action more people-centered, helping people understand that not everything that's good for the planet is good for people. And so we have to find the sweet spot where we're taking rapid climate action whilst enabling people to realize their rights. That's part one. In terms of football, the UNFCCC have brought together the Sports for Climate Action framework, which is a fantastic initiative, and it is getting more signatories by the day. And any organizations here that haven't signed up, I'd strongly encourage them to do so. So that's a really good voluntary initiative, guided like the center, but by some 5 key principles that help to guide it. Now, it's not a statutory element of the climate negotiations. What it does do is it helps bring the negotiations into the real world, quote unquote, in a very meaningful way. And I think I'm a little bit like a broken record on this point, but I think that is the role of sport, is to bring what is quite an abstract negotiation process into the lives of people in a meaningful way. So one point that I'll just flag here is that I'm working with the European Football for Development Network on an event that will happen towards the end of COP in Braga in Breda in the Netherlands, where we will hopefully take the outcome of what's called the Action for Climate Empowerment strand of negotiations under the COP and try to ask ourselves, how can football make this outcome a reality? How can the football community rally around this key element of the negotiations and make it real for people? And so that's a very exciting opportunity, and one that, you know, I'd encourage everyone to get involved with. And we have to start asking ourselves that more and more. How do we bridge between the negotiations and the real world, and how do we use sport to do that?
Indeed, yeah. One of our participants would like to hear the opinion of the panelists on whether or not mega sporting events are justifiable or acceptable in relation to the emerging, to their carbon footprint. Maybe over to you, Elena, on this particular question. Your own views on the acceptability and justifiability of mega sporting events in today's context, if you will.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important question, and I do think that the answer to that, or at least one way to address it, is to allow a diversity of narratives around these events, and have it really. Someone mentioned, I think it was Seán, to the bottom up, right? And for that to really to happen, and to be for it to be a real dialogue, there needs to be information that is getting to communities impacted, and channels for these organizations to express and to demand their say at the table. So I do think that is an important aspect. You know, we need to really be inclusive around these events in terms of who's benefiting, who's paying the price, and to have it really be an inclusive and a dialogue where there are different voices being heard, and not just one narrative about who this is benefiting.
We'll ask that next question to you, Jason, if that's okay. Some examples that you came across of initiatives by sports events to actually address climate solutions for local communities. As an example, Battery Stadium, for instance.
Sure. I think, well, sports can be a really progressive early leader on technology, on sustainability solutions, on organic local food. I'll use one example from my time working for the late Paul G. Allen, who owned the Seattle Seahawks. And we were in Seattle, which has its, brand of having cloudy weather all the time. And we wanted to leverage the influence of CenturyLink Field and the Seattle Seahawks and the MLS Seattle Sounders as a means to influence fan behavior and adopting sustainable practices in their home and climate-friendly practices. So we put up a megawatt of solar PV at the venue in an educational way to demonstrate that solar productive energy is viable even in cloudy Seattle. And then linking them with programs with the utilities so they can actually adopt those practices in their home and look at, how they mitigate their own individual carbon footprint as a family member, as a fan. So sports has the power to bring their fans on that journey and be a bridge between government and industry and the community, because they, my really good friend Alan Hershkowitz would always say, all industries meet on a sports field, right? So it's this really interesting role that these venues have, and I even equate them to a modern day, town hall or community room, because you get like a good chunk of a city's population, a community's population in one room at a time, and how do you shape their thinking through strategic communications and leveraging the influence of their athlete icons to talk about these things, particularly on children who have profound influence from the heroes and sheroes that are out there influencing their decision to become an athlete or practice certain sport. So these are the softer things that I see as more powerful. Yes, we'll have EV charging stations in there, and that will become the norm. Yes, we'll have renewable energy. Yes, we'll have zero water toilet fixtures, all these other things. Yes, we'll have local organic food. But that softer way, again, like how they tackle the culture and consciousness of a community's association to climate change, I think is a really profound way that I see happening all over the world now, which is great. In the last 10 years, it's gotten even more so. So it's great.
Yeah. We're going to be wrapping up in the next few minutes, but I'd like to ask that same question from each of you also to wrap this up really. So we're going to try and project ourselves 10 to say 15 years from now, right? The world has basically understood the intersection between climate and human rights, and how that affects sports and mega sporting events. So the level of awareness has grown, has picked up. People are aware global sporting events are equipped. So in your own respective views, and in short, what does a best-in-class event looks like in 2030 or so, 2032 or so? What does it look like in short? Starting with you, Seán.
Well, I guess it could look like two very different things. I'm assuming we're hoping we get it right, and that we have survived the climate crisis, because I think people in reading the IPCC reports don't realize that in itself is a negotiated document. It leaves out some of the starkest climate science, and the impacts could be much sooner than we anticipate. So we just have to bear that in mind. If we survive, a sports event in 2030 will draw all of its legitimacy from the communities in which it takes place in, will leave a net positive impact on those communities. It will hopefully leave a net positive impact in terms of the environment as well. And it will be a lever for local sustainable development. And you will see cities clamoring to host major sporting events because they recognize that the long-term benefits are enormous. And if we can turn the book, if that can be our North Star, then it will be very, very positive indeed. I would also just say, and add this really quickly, it would also allow the platforming of people like the Marcus Rashfords of the world, who will come forward and use their platforms to highlight serious issues of injustice and help us rectify them as we go forward.
I like it. Jason, same question. What does best in class look like in 2030 plus?
I just love that you mentioned Marcus Rashford. I love him. Well, I agree with Seán. The time for mitigating and doing less bad is over. Like, we have to actually look at how we contribute positively to the environment and society because of these events. So if I look at one where the event was hosted, probably within a more vulnerable part of the world, that this event now enables them development in a way that progresses their food, their energy, their water, and their climate agenda for a country. So I would say, because of an event like a World Cup or an Olympics, that country has better air quality. It has cleaner water. It has safer places for children to play and practice their sport. It's got renewable energy, all electric grid. Like, all these things are really, really crucial, that it actually contributes, because of that event, that country or place or community is better off from it. I think that's where we have to head.
Elena, project us and all the participants into what the ideal world looks like around next year.
I think it was all covered, but I have to say, I also imagine one where there's gender equity as well. So that plus gender equity.
Very clear. Thank you all very, very much. Well, you three, first of all, obviously, for your engagement on that important discussion to try and make sense of sport, climate change, and human rights. Thank you, of course, to all the participants for your attention, for what I believe was a stimulating discussion for all of you. So thank you very much for helping make sense of this critical topic and relatively complex topic as well. We're now looking forward to seeing you all at the next session at 4 o'clock CET, so West European time, Paris, Geneva time, if you want an example. And we will be looking at sex and gender in sports policy, a human rights perspective. We will welcome a panel of athletes, of sports bodies, and human rights experts to move the current harmful debate towards a solutions-driven and human rights-focused conversation. Thank you all very, very much, and enjoy the rest of the program.
All right. Thank you.